Welcome to On the Other Hand. The Utah State Board of Education has a draft document called Gender Identity Guidance for Utah Public Education and is up for public comment until this Monday. And seeing as my controversial topics bingo card is missing transgenderism, now's as good a time as any to discuss this specific instance. I've browsed the document, and here are some quotes from the proposed guidelines I find noteworthy, with my thoughts interspersed. The Utah State Board of Education recognizes that academic success depends on access to an educational environment that is safe, conducive to the learning process, and free from unnecessary disruption. I agree. Schools should be free from unnecessary disruption so kids can learn. Schools should accept a student's consistently asserted gender identity, even if the gender identity is different from the biological sex. Consistent assertion involves more than casual declaration of gender identity, but it does not necessarily require any substantiating evidence. Establishing gender identity can present differently from student to student. So what does consistent assertion mean? It means more than just a casual declaration, but the guideline doesn't outline what it actually entails to meet the standard. And of course, this vague standard is what the rest of the document is based on, so the rest of the document is vague. Students may ask teachers and other school staff to refer to them by an alternative name or pronoun that does not align with those listed on their official school records. Students have the right to be addressed by names and pronouns that correspond to their consistently asserted gender identities. So I don't think students have a right to be addressed however they want, even if that corresponds to a vague, consistent assertion of gender identity. I think we should be kind to people. I think we should make people feel as comfortable as they can. But I think this opens up a can of worms or a minefield that teachers and administrators would have to navigate in addition to actually, doing their jobs. Example 1. A student who appears to be male arrives at school in a dress. Unless the dress style violates the school's dress code, the student should not be required to change. This seems to be the literal definition of an unnecessary disruption, which they outlined at the very start as something they wanted to avoid. I think what this document intends to do is far different than what it actually would do. Students should have access to facilities that correspond to their consistently asserted gender identity. No student should be compelled to use an alternative restroom. If any student desires increased privacy or feels uncomfortable using group facilities, schools should make every effort to provide the student with reasonable access to an alternative facility. An alternative arrangement for any student should be safe and accessible and provided in a way that minimizes the loss of instructional time and protects the privacy of the student. Example 2. A student who is uncomfortable because a student who is transgender has been using a certain restroom or locker room should be allowed to use an alternative restroom and or locker room. So this standard says that if a transgender student makes someone else feel uncomfortable, the transgender student has every right to be there. It's the uncomfortable kids who need to move, not the person who made them uncomfortable. And keep in mind that being transgender does not necessarily require any substantiating evidence. So if a male is allowed in the female's locker room in junior high, the females who are uncomfortable with that need to speak up and get different accommodations. This again seems like the very definition of an unnecessary disruption and ripe for abuse. Now, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I firmly believe that these proposed guidelines aren't acceptable answers. For example, I think it's reasonable to give a transgender student a separate locker space if they request it. That way their choices don't disrupt anyone else's experience in gym. It also seems silly to me to imply that in order to accommodate a very small minority of students, we should disrupt or endanger other students instead. And some of you might rightly say that these are just guidelines, so what's the big deal? Even if it passes, it's not binding, it's mostly a suggestion. Personally, I think even these suggestions are out of line and are taking activist positions in the name of benefiting all students. The road to hell is paved in good intentions, and I'm not in favor of these paving stones outlined in this document. So I hope this was a worthwhile and reasonable take on public school accommodations for transgender youth. If you think I'm wrong or missed the mark, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you live in Utah, I would highly recommend you take the time to submit your comments to the state school board before Monday. Link is in the description.